Hello, this is Fiona, one of the co-hosts of the DM's Book Club, a weekly book club podcast where we read about some Dungeons & Dragons and discuss how we might include them in our role-playing campaigns. In this episode, I interviewed Ajit George, the Director of Operations of Shanti Bhavan's Children's Project, an international non-profit organisation based in Bangalore, India, that provides free education to socially disadvantaged children. Ajit is also a game designer, diversity consultant and activist in the gaming community, having written for a variety of indie game companies, including Bully Pulpit Games and Monty Cook. Ajit is probably best known in the tabletop RPG industry for his role as the creator, co-lead designer and author of the Dungeons & Dragons one-shot anthology, Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, the first anthology of D&D adventures to be written entirely by black and brown authors. In the heart of the Ethereal Plane lies an ancient and mysterious city called the Radiant Citadel. Through tradition, cooperation and ancestral magic, 15 civilizations are bound to this wondrous site. Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel is an anthology of exciting adventures that explore the cultures and myths of these realms. I love this book. It's been one of my big highlights of this year to read. It's beautiful, the setting is so evocative, and the adventures in it feel so different to anything else I've read before. I was incredibly honoured and a bit overwhelmed that I got to talk to Ajit about his work on this book and how much it inspired me as a DM. So please, if you haven't got your copy yet, go and get it and run it for your tables immediately. You won't be disappointed. You can find links to Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel and Ajit's other work in this episode's show notes. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy. Brilliant. So we'll just start straight off really nice and chill. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, I am Ajit George. In my full-time job, I am Director of Operations for the Shanti Bhavan Children's Project, which is a education and poverty alleviation nonprofit based in India. But in the world of games, I have been a writer, a designer, and particularly an advocate for people of color within gaming spaces for opportunities for them, upward mobility in terms of jobs and positions, but just representation for people of color in games.
Exactly. And you have such an incredible list of credits to your name. I was going through them when I was doing my research for this interview, and instantly I saw The Warren, Bully Pulpit Games, which is one of my favourite games. I was like, oh, that's great. And obviously working for a couple of Monty Cook games as well, I saw. So I guess we'll start right at the beginning. How did you get into role-playing games?
So that would have been my mom. It's really hilarious, but, she bought me the original, or not the original, but one of the early edition of D&D, the red box set for Dungeons & Dragons. I must have been second grade, first grade, something like that. I was relatively young. And just looking even at the cover of this box, this red box, Dungeons & Dragons is so prevalent now, but at the time it was this new and novel thing and so weird and different, particularly for an Indian kid growing up in the US with traditional parents. It was so outside of my normal experiences. And it kind of hit me with this sense of wonder and amazement. And I got really into it, but I didn't have a lot of people to play with. So I think I put it aside for a while. And then I started really playing in high school. And my high school biology teacher, of all people, is the one who ran a 4-year campaign for a bunch of us, which was magnificent and a little transcendent, to be honest. Awoke a storytelling side to me and a side of imagination and creativity. And I loved it.
Do you have a particular favorite genre at all? Obviously, I know D&D is obviously traditionally sort of high fantasy, but do you prefer horror? Do you prefer maybe sci-fi? I'm guessing because obviously your credits, your RPG credits, obviously span quite a few different game systems. I didn't know if you had a particular favorite genre you like to write for or like to play in.
High fantasy obviously is something that's really interesting to me, and I think probably the next would be modern gothic horror in the vein of a World of Darkness, Vampire, and all of those games that are associated with it, including games that are not gothic horror, like Changeling the Dreaming is very much not gothic horror, but beautiful and tragic and gorgeous. And so I very much, I think those two games, those two systems, Dungeons and Dragons and World of Darkness have been my two great loves as RPGs over the many years.
Are you typically like a forever DM then, or do you get a chance to play every so often or play more often than you run games?
Yeah, these days I barely get to play, and I haven't run a game in forever, Fiona. It's a very strange place, as I think as you become more immersed in the professional side of games, I find that at least some of those in my circles are playing less than they might have when they first came to RPGs, where their entire focus was playing. Now a lot of my focus is on writing or working on games or working to advocate for people of color in different mediums, like networking events or so on and so forth.
Well, what a shame. But at the same time, it's still, yeah, you're still part of it and you're still doing so much work for it. So let's just get straight into it then. So for those people who've been completely oblivious and living under a rock, could you tell us what is Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel and why does it start to stand out from, say, traditional or even just normal D&D source books or anthologies?
Yeah, Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel is an adventurous anthology put out by Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And it is one of the newest books in their line. It has a lot of important firsts to it. The primary being it is the first Dungeons & Dragons book in D&D's nearly 50-year history to be written entirely by people of color. 16 writers, including myself, worked on this book. It is also the first D&D book to be led by a person of color, namely myself. And it is the first D&D book to have both the cover artist and the alternate cover artist both be women of color. And then overall, 50 people of color worked on this book, from editor positions to artists to consultants to designers. And that is also certainly a first for Dungeons & Dragons. It may very well be a first for all TTRPGs. And it's possible, short of like maybe a AAA game by like Rockstar, where you've got 300, 400 people working on it, and then maybe 50 people happen to be people of color.
Yeah.
It may actually be among the first, and even in the larger scheme of RPGs, to have that many people of color, at least for a US-based game. So it's quite unique in many categories. It's also the first real new material in terms of new setting material that Dungeons & Dragons has done in 5th edition. And that is not previously attached to some IP, whether the Critical Role IP or the Magic IP. This is the first completely brand new material created specifically for 5th edition. In many ways, it's the first new material in many years setting material put out by Dungeons & Dragons. So in that way, it's also first and very fresh and new.
And I'll just start off by saying I absolutely love it as a result. And so I'm so glad I get a chance to talk to you and just say how much, because as soon as I obviously saw the artwork, I was like, oh my God, I'm already in. And then seeing you in the videos describing about it and saying how different it was to what we've had previously. And, and this is no dismissal of previous Wizard of the Coast products, but there's something about the way you were describing this sort of UN style sort of Radiant Citadel just there and then connected to all these different realms that were so different and had so much life that was nothing I'd ever seen before or read before in D&D. And I just knew that as soon as I had to have a copy of the book to read it, and it's just been an absolute joy to read through it and actually play some of the one-shots as well. So where did the sort of initial idea for the Radiant Citadel come about for you then?
The book itself, the idea came from, my work on Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and really loving working on the Indian-inspired material, which was also brand new to Ravenloft and to D&D. And I really wanted to do something more with it and expand that. I just had this vision in my head of an entire book like that. And so after I wrapped up my work on Ravenloft, and I wasn't going to be traveling for a while because of the pandemic, I realized this was like an opportunity to try to make a book like this come to fruition. I pitched it to Jeremy Crawford, who is one of the two principals for Dungeons & Dragons. He's one of the two game architects, along with Chris Perkins, and Wes Snyder, who was the lead for Ravenloft. And to my surprise, they were resoundingly positive and not only accepted my idea, but asked me to be a co-lead, which I just didn't think was possible because I'm not a full-time employee for Wizards of the Coast.
Sure.
And I guess that's also another first in that I'm an outside consultant leading a D&D book, which is also very unique, and somebody pitching an idea outside of D&D for D&D. And I think that the last time was Eberron. So it's been a long time. So that's how the actual book came to existence. For the Radiant Citadel itself, that was a process of reading and kind of immersing myself in the works of all the other writers. I knew we needed some kind of way to link all the pieces together. In that way, it was going to be a little like Candlekeep in Candlekeep Mysteries. But I wanted something a sense of a place of wonder and uniqueness, and something that was hopeful and more positive than a lot of what you see in D&D, a place of respite. And I think that was really informed deeply by the times that we live in. I strongly believe that art is informed by the circumstances of the climate of society, of the individual obviously creating it. And so it was drawing on a lot of things in my personal life and in what was happening in the world around me, but also deeply informed by the works of everyone that I was reading. I haven't actually said this anywhere else, so this would definitely be a first. A lot of people have speculated that, like, okay, this is like the Radiant Citadel is like Deep Space Nine or like Babylon 5. They've had so many different theories, and I think there was also Mass Effect was another one, and I was like, I actually haven't played Mass Effect, so I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm familiar with the game, but I was like, yes,
you just sort of like, yeah, sure.
I actually was like, you know what, you all can run with this, and that sounds great, but that's actually not where I'm coming from. So Mass Effect, I've never played. I've never watched Babylon 5, and I have never watched Deep Space Nine. My nerd credits are terrible right now.
Oh, no.
Everybody's going to be gasping. I've watched a lot of Star Trek, just not Deep Space Nine. Yeah. I just haven't been able to get into it. To be honest, it came in many ways from, or was it partially inspired by me thinking about the Belter dream in The Expanse and how the Belters wanted a place of their own. And really why The Expanse comes to mind in many ways is it was the first piece of science fiction where I saw people of color unabashedly centered throughout the story. And when other cultures or other sci-fi pieces talked about these multicultural or these like ethnic diverse cultures, it never resonated because it was actually usually white people that were centered. The Expanse was very much about centering people of color. And the Belters were really about, trying to create a place where they could live in peace, but other cultures, maybe the Earthers and the Martians, could also live together. And so the genesis of this is sort of the ideal state if the Belters had gotten their way and they were able to work together with the Martians and the Earthers to have like this can maybe a home world that they all live together. So that's the true genesis, and I've never really talked about that. I want to do a thread on it, but I just haven't had a chance to talk about it.
Oh, well, you're going to have to, because The Expanse is such an incredible, obviously, I know, set of books, but also the TV show is astounding and it's visually impressive as well as some great performances. God, I'm going to have to go back and watch that now. But I totally see
it's mesmerizing to me. Yeah, I love the TV series, and it was very important to me, and I was watching a lot of it while I was working on Radiant Citadel.
And it's actually a really good role-playing game as well. I've had a chance to play through a few bits of that. And again, it's a very different side to that in terms of mechanics and stuff. But yeah, really enjoyed that. Like for me, I definitely thought, Deep Space Nine when I read it. But it's obviously so much more than that. And my other question really was, did you always plan to have the number of writers that you did? Because obviously you've got 16 in total, including yourself. But you've left it open to have, obviously, DMs to come up with their own planes of existence and stuff. Was it always going to be set at 16? Did you plan to have more, less? What's the thought?
We talked about more. There were certain limitations in terms of our page count, right? So we had to keep to a specific number of pages, and that would also determine the size of adventures. And if we had more writers on it, that would have also limited the adventures would have had to get shorter. I know people wanted longer adventures in places, and other people are like, oh man, I could have used another 30 pages of setting material around the Radiant Citadel. And I hear you and feel the same way. But also, as the lead on it, that was a struggle for me to make a decision about, am I centering myself in my own writing, or am I centering my writers and their writing? And the ultimate decision was, while the book's name Radiant Citadel is in the title, it does say journeys through the Radiant Citadel, meaning it's not really about the Radiant Citadel. It's about the places you go through to, from the Radiant Citadel. And I really wanted to center the other cultures and the other writers. And so I think my page count is actually among the shortest of all of it. And that was a conscious decision.
Of course.
I think there's easily a source book entirely around the Radiant Citadel, and that would have been a lot of fun to write, but that wasn't this book.
No. And I think what I love about the Radiant Citadel as well, because again, the way you've described it is obviously incredibly beautiful, but there's so much like I definitely was like, I need to know more about this amazing place. But I think what you've done, and again, this is absolute kudos to your writing and then obviously the editors and stuff, but you've left it so that there are bits of interest, which obviously then the DMs can go off and make their own stories out of it. Whereas maybe in other places, like there's already been expanded history. I'm thinking now of like Rock of Brawl from Spelljammer. There's loads of stuff on that. But here is like, it's so different, those two places, as sort of hubs of activity. And I was just like, yeah, Radiant Citadel every single time. That's what I'm going to, as soon as they pop to another place of hub, it's not Sigil, it's not Rock of Brawl, it's going to be Radiant Citadel because it's more interesting. You've got like the idea of the way the government is and obviously the healing stuff. It's just so, like you said, I know you mentioned this in a couple of other interviews, this idea of hope punk. And it's the first time I've actually come across that term. And I actually was like, yeah, I actually really like that as this idea that we are wanting positive change. And why not just have that without, I know you've said like, oh, there could be like, maybe if you want like a hidden agenda, there's something maybe not so right. But I don't want that. I want to have a really nice place that my players can go to and there's no hidden agenda at all, and then they can go off on other adventures as respite. So yeah, just everything about that Radiant Citadel, it just feels like I want my players to come visit here and have a really good time and for it. So
yeah, I love that you said that, Fiona. I think with the Radiant Citadel, it was an enormous challenge to fit in everything I wanted with the vision in a short page count. And then to create enough hooks, and this is something Wes and I talked a lot about with our writers. My red lines are very extensive. It's like, great, you've got this, but you need to give another hook or another imaginative piece. And if you read through most of the paragraphs in the Radiant Citadel, I think there's a push point at almost every end of every paragraph where it's like, oh, cool, I could do something with this. Like I have this paragraph and it ends with almost a question or an element that's confusing or interesting. I can riff off of that. And that has to be my trust to the readers that they would use this as seeds for their fertile imagination. And this is also, weirdly, my own kind of like my own take from a player or a reader where, you read deeply about something and you're like, when it's over-explained, you're like, oh man, that's actually kind of disappointing. It was like so much cooler like 2 paragraphs ago until you went into all this stuff. And, part of the magic being a writer is like, okay, you know what? I'm going to put just enough seeds that your fertile and amazing imagination is going to take it in places that I would have never guessed. Yeah. And I've seen really amazing people, really amazing takes on the Radiant Citadel. I was like, oh, that's wild. Like I would never have gone in that direction, but I love that you've gone in that direction. I also think it's been really interesting to see how, positively certain people have taken it and some challenges others have had. And I kind of love that you're really digging the Radiant Citadel because what I've noticed is some of the hardest pushback have come from white men who are like, oh, there needs to be more conflict and I need more fighting and I need more details. I need all the details about every single nook and cranny, and I need all the fighting and all the conflict and war. And I've seen more women, more people from the LGBTQ community go like, hey, this is beautiful. Yep. It's kind of like I love that can be like my home. I can value this place. I can desire to fight to protect it if there is problems outside, and there's enough challenges that they're not obvious challenges. Maybe they're socio-political challenges or other things. And there's easy to make some external conflicts for the place as well. But I do notice that where the strongest positive responses have been from women, other people of color, the LGBT community. And I think maybe that speaks to things that we ourselves desire and that the way we think about fiction and the way we think about environments and what we prioritize. And it's been really interesting to see that, dichotomy of like who's criticizing it and who's loving it, because it's a very stark difference that I've noticed again and again and again as I tally.
That is quite interesting. And I hope that then that is an indicator, not just for Wizards, but all RPGs, because like you said, it's such a big milestone. I don't think any other RPG book has done exactly what you said, like it's been led by a majority person of color team. So I'm hoping now that people are like, oh, so in this space, it's not just white men, straight white men, cis men just playing their war games. We have room at the table for people of disabilities, people of color, people from LGBT, women to run these games, have these games, tell their own stories and stuff. Yeah, I think hopefully the Radiant Citadel is merely just the first step for not just 5th edition books or D&D in general, but for all sort of RPGs. There obviously is a thriving indie tabletop community, which I know you've been a part of as well. And I know that you have done a slight expansion, Journeys Beyond the Radiant Citadel. Is that extra stuff you didn't manage to put in the book, or was that extra carry on writing, we'll put some more stuff in? Because I really enjoyed that when I found that. I was like, oh,
yeah. My role with that was pretty limited, but it was the writers who really wanted to expand their sections and talk more about it. And they did a wonderful job. It's a great addition to the core book. And if there's one DM's Guild product that I would strongly recommend, that's the one, though there are a few others that are really, really thoughtfully done. Mm-hmm. But kind of to return to what we were talking about in terms of like, ways of thinking about things differently and how we need more women or more people of color kind of focusing on it. One of the other criticisms this once again was, it's really easy to like notice where the criticism is coming from, and it's
of course
from white men. We're like, oh yeah, there's just another festival at the beginning of this, starting of this adventure, and I was like, oh, you all have dealt with 50 years of starting in a tavern and never griped about it, right? Like how many adventures start off in a tavern and we don't think about it?
Yeah.
And I think to flatten it and just say it's another festival is to not really understand the nuance and complexity of people of color, right? It's like it's almost like saying, oh, Christmas is the same as Halloween, which is the same as Diwali, which is the same as, Ramadan. Yeah. Like, it's like, those are really different events. Yeah. Like the structure is, you could say that they're holidays or festivals, but that word does not encompass the complexity of each of these events. All of the people of color that are working on it, especially the ones obviously who centered festivals as a start or centered around their adventure, was like, this festival really means something to my culture. This is an entry point or a gateway to understanding very easily and immediately the new culture that you're entering, right? And it allows you. But those festivals are pretty different from adventure to adventure. And it does take maybe a more than a superficial reading to understand that. But I think taking the time and effort, I think they add a hell of a lot more diversity than your, ye old tavern that you get, or, the quest that comes from like, Princess in Distress or something like that. Right? These are very much more thoughtful in that regard.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Like, again, I was aware that it was the festivals, but they always have, they're not just tacked on. Like a pub is always tacked on, right? Whereas these ones, you had, trials, you have to partake in them in order to get not only the setting, the feeling of the setting as well, but also, it helps with the adventure. You get information, in the first one, the Salted Legacy, you have to get the renown and respect. So you got to take part in sort of festivals, sort of challenges there. Yeah. Certainly one of my favorites ones is the apologies, I can't remember the title of the adventure now. The one where we you have that full week where there's the curfew is lifted and you're just celebrating the sort of the night sky and the
Shadow of the Sun. That's actually based off an Iranian festival that banishes darkness. And it was funny because I was just over at Justice's house, the writer of that, just a few days ago, and we were literally just talking about the festival and what it meant to Iranian culture. Yeah, it's a very important one, but it very much links to the culture. Same with the Night of the Remembered. It's based off of the Day of the Dead for and the Mexican holiday or the Mexican festival, and it's very integral to the culture and the people and the way they think about the dead and how they remember the dead and what the dead have in relationship to the living, which is a theme that runs through the entire adventure. So being like, oh, it's so much more complex and more deep than a pub that just happens to be like, oh, you run into a pub. Great. Oh, a pub innkeeper gives you an adventure. Great.
It's like, But as well, like I feel like quite a number of the adventures in this book, sure, there is combat, and I know for some people that's that's what they want out of their adventures, and that's how they play their D&D. But I feel sometimes, obviously, there's several layers, each very different in each story. So, for example, one of the later ones, there's obviously a lot of political intrigue. I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but you appear in the middle of an opera house to confront the villain and all that sort of thing, because there's always different political things that you're trying to work out. And again, with the Shadow of the Sun one, again, there's that huge sort of the different political structures. They sort of vary between each of the realms. And it's just so different than the normal sort of like, it's a king and a castle, and that's your political system. So it was actually quite a joy to go, these systems are different. And how would players who may not be aware of them or not have lived underneath systems before, how did they interact with it? How did they play with it? And I just always thought this instantly as more and more ideas about how I would run these games and stuff. And that's what I love about this book, is that as soon as I read it, I go, how would I run this? Oh, I could do this and I could do this. And I assume that's what you want. I assume that's what you want. You want people to go take it and run and do their own games and stuff. So
we absolutely want people to interpret different ways. We're very open-ended about it. The writers have been very supportive. We're like, We would rather you try and experiment with these cultures and get it wrong, and it's okay, and make mistakes, it's fine, but enjoy and indulge and just see where it takes you. And I think you're right in that, like, it is very fresh and very different in that a lot of old school D&D feels purely escapist, and this is purely fantasy, and there's nothing else beyond like the fantasy element of it, which is fine on one level. But an old writing teacher of mine once said that, like, escapist fantasy purely for the sake of escapist fantasy can end up being a little bit like propaganda. And what I think he meant was the old kind of Roman circus and bread, where the masses are distracted from their problems and hide from their problems by being purely entertained. They're forced not to think when they're being entertained. Their brain is like switched off so they can only just be entertained. And that can be great in small doses when the stresses of life is too much and you just need some little bit of escape. But I also think there's lots of room for thoughtful engagement. And, Justice is a great example. You brought that up about the political factions, right? He's been a little circumspect about the motivations behind it, but he's gotten a little more open since the Iranian revolutions. And he's been a lot more outspoken about criticisms about the government. Is that it really was his take on modern day Iran and the West's perception of the people, right? So like the West is like, oh, you all are theocratic, like nut jobs. And actually the people are not that. And they're not all like behind the Ayatollah. And then, at the time he was weighing the complexities of like the Ayatollah's regime, and is that good or is that bad? And he was trying to be very careful of like not condemning it, because it's very easy to condemn it from the outside. And then also have like these revolutionaries who are fighting against it. He talked in a panel recently at BagBagCon about one of the most interesting subversive elements in the adventure. And there's so many like deep cuts with these works that it's, you really have to read deeply to kind of understand what's actually happening.
Of course.
The better reward for the players is if they side with the theocracy. And that's not obvious immediately, but if you side with the theocracy and the angels, the last battle is easier and the reward is bigger than if you side with the rebels. The last battle is harder and the reward is smaller. And that's a commentary on power and how it's easier for us to go along with the power structures in place than to fight against them. And our reward is often bigger if you side with it. Like, there are reasons why power structures remain, because you're really well rewarded to stay in line. You're less rewarded, and the challenge is stronger if you're not. So there's lots of that kind of stuff in the book.
Yes.
And it is not necessarily obvious at first read, but the more you play with it and the more you think about it, the more we hope that you do have escape and you have great games and you have a lot of fun, but that there's this something working at the back of your head and making you think about maybe your institutional biases and the kind of like elements that you expect. And I think this book in that regard sets it apart from a lot of other D&D books
100%.
in the fierce political commentary and the fierce socio-political commentary.
I think the other thing that stands out for me, because I maybe some people would be not scared, but there's always that worry that, well, I don't want to portray a character from a culture that I don't know anything about. And I think one thing you do incredibly well in the book is that you have this sort of bit at the beginning called thoughtful introductions about describing about how you can role play people who live in these realms and stuff. And I know each gazetteer has like questions, like as you would do when you were building your character anyway, but like you've read through the gazetteer, that's amazing. Here's some things you want to think about if you are from this realm. And you pick up on the key points, or each author picks up on the key points from the adventure, from the themes that are throughout. And all of it is just so inviting, and it's not preachy, which I knew it wouldn't be anyway, but it's just nice to be like, hey, we welcome you. You can take part in our realms. You can be whatever you want. You can be from these realms. And here's how to do it sensitively and in a way to encourage that. And I think we need more and more of that in our games, that we can, because we are telling stories and we want to tell different stories and not the same old, as you said, we meet in a tavern. It's a lot of white men. We go out and save the princess. We don't want to do that anymore. We want to experience these things, and we should be open to sharing these stories, like treat them with sensitivity and sort of appreciate them, but not appropriate them.
I'm really glad that resonated with you, Fiona. And I think that was something that was important to us. But simultaneously, for all of the reasons you outlined, that was definitely part of our motivation.
Yes,
but the other part was to alleviate fear from people that are not from those cultures, that it's okay to play with those cultures. Yes. And to say, hey, you don't need our permission. We just want to give you some guidelines, right? Here's some guidelines to think about. And all of the writers very much feel strongly that we would rather you play with our work and make whatever mistakes or
Yes.
get it wrong or whatever, but we would rather that happen than you not play with it and you be too scared and you look at it as like a nice museum piece that's put on your shelf, but you never touch it and interact with it and engage with it. Our works are meant to be engaged with, to be taken apart, to be remashed, to have different, interpretations. I think we all love it. And I don't think any of us are particularly worried about it, unless you turn it into some like sexist neo-Nazi piece, and like that'd be very hard.
Then that's the line drawn. Yeah.
yeah. Some obvious disclaimers there, but I think by and large we really want you to have fun with this and enjoy it, and to live in those worlds that we've built.
Was there any particular challenges, would you say, putting the book together? Was there anything that you found particularly difficult co-leading it at all?
Sure.
If anything, there might not have been. You might have an absolute dream.
No. It was incredibly challenging. It was about 2 years of my life, from inception, creating the idea, to the final, working with a marketing team and all the marketing meetings. There's some places where I certainly can't talk about it. There was some difference of opinions on certain marketing elements, but beyond that, I won't go into further detail.
Nope, that's fine.
I think the greatest challenge is, it was an enormous amount of work. It's just a ton of work, and I was juggling a full-time job on top of this.
Of course.
So it's almost like 2 full-time jobs back to back. And the greatest challenge is also the greatest joy, which is working with so many different personalities. At one point, I was managing 20 plus people, because you had the writers and then you had consultants and, people on the WotC team that I'm working with. And, you're just juggling a lot, and different people have different ideas, and you have to work with people's different working styles.
Of course. And
really harmonizing and making that work. I also think that there's interesting challenges with working within a specific parameter of an expected 220-page D&D book with no leeway for it to be longer. And, and people don't realize that the D&D books can't just add one more page. It has to go by by a chunk. It's I think it's 30-page increments or something like that, right?
Really? Wow.
So, if you look at any D&D book, they're all within 3 or 4 different categories of page counts, and they're all separated by 20 or 30 pages, right? They're either 220 or 246 or 250 or something like that.
I will have to check my collection now and count all that.
Yeah. There's also been a switch over since Candlekeep. Before that, the font size was smaller, and Candlekeep was the first book that they had a larger font size, so the page count starts switching at that time.
Right, of course.
But every book from Candlekeep onwards fits into a certain page count. Right. And so there's a lot of interesting, and maybe it's not interesting to the casual reader, but it's interesting to people who are wonky and the mechanics of how books are put together. Yeah. There were a lot of interesting challenges there. I think, part of it is just also, I think that, the other great challenge is there was weight. There was weight to this book, the weight to the idea that this is the first book of its kind. Yeah. That there were so many people of color hoping for a book like this to exist, hoping we would get it right when it was announced. So many writers have fears about how their own communities and people from their culture would take it. But there was a sense of we were doing something important.
Yes.
That we were doing something historical, that in the moment we realized the weight and gravity of the work we were doing. And with that came a lot of fear and anxiety around working on this book, because we didn't want to get it wrong. We wanted to do justice. So there's a lot of intensity of emotion around it. And also fear that if we failed at any point, Wizards of the Coast would have shelved the book. I think the former executive producer of D&D, Ray Wininger, talks about books coming to fruition, ideas being gestated for books, but then it never fully materializing, and that they actually shelved projects. And I know that they have in the past shelved books that for whatever reason didn't come together, didn't make sense, didn't work. And I knew that if we were not able to do it right under the deadlines and timelines we had, because we had very tight deadlines, very tight timelines, and we had an expanded timeline, but for our mother books, but it was still very tight work, that the book would get shelved and would never see the light of day, and you and I would never be having this conversation. And as the co-lead of that, I had an incredible level of weight on my shoulders around that. And so there was a lot to emotionally juggle, and a lot to logistically juggle, and a lot to manage as a lead.
I could only emphasize about that, and I'm so glad that all that hard work and all that effort has led to us chatting, but also to an incredible book as well. So then the flip side of the coin, which you've kind of mentioned a little bit, what was the bit that sort of filled you with joy? Was there any particular part, like either writing it, or I know you're probably going to say like having the book in my hand, because that's what most people say, but was there any part of the process that you were like, oh my God, it's happening, this is amazing?
I think weirdly, when I first got the book in my hands, I was a little numb and a little, I didn't know what to make of it.
Of course.
My wife had gotten the book. Amusingly, my wife had gotten the book earlier than I did. And the reason is that she's the narrative director on a AAA D&D video game. And so her studio got access to the book first or early because they need to take a look at what's being created in D&D. So she brought it home one day as a surprise for me. I was like, wait, what? How did you get this book? And it was wild. So it was this really surreal moment, but I think it was numbing. It was in kind of shell shock about it. But in terms of like excitement, I can definitely tell you some of the moments of joy were reading first drafts of other writers, and being amazed by the worlds and words they had woven, and just being stunned at the creativity and talent, and just being, wow, this is so good. This is so damn good. And that was definitely a moment. Another moment was really feeling like the Radiant Citadel was clicking in my head, and that like all of the pieces were falling into place, and it made sense to me, and I was like falling in love with it. And my wife is one of those people who like weirdly puts all of the pieces of something in her head, and she's quite nonverbal at times, and she just sees in images and so on and so forth, and it all kind of coalesces, and then she could write really quickly, and she just outpour of writing in a way that I can't do. I think of myself as more like somebody who's like chiseling away at a piece of rock, and it is like slowly coming together and slowly being shaped, and it takes a long time for me. And the Radiant Citadel was like me chiseling at this rock for the longest time, trying to see what would come out of this thing and what shape it would build. When it's just really coalesced, I was very excited. There was a lot of like joy and excitement there. And I think the third moment was when I started seeing the art, because I was also in the art review, and seeing how good the art was and being amazed by some of the pieces, and was like, wow, we really, really nailed it. And I was really happy with it. So that was kind of exciting. But also that brings me to a point of like where you're like, oh, were this challenging or hard? One of the hardest moments was seeing there's a few pieces of art for Radiant Citadel that got killed. And that was killed by me because I was like, oh, this isn't capturing it. One of the biggest challenges was really capturing the Radiant Citadel itself, because it's such a weird location. And to describe, it's like, oh, there's this giant diamond floating in the ethereal plane,
right?
And wrapped around it is the fossilized remains of this like mythical beast. And out of that fossilized remains, a city has been carved. Oh, by the way, surrounding that are like, these 15 gemstones that are kind of vehicles for other things. And like the artist is like, what in the world have you been smoking? What is this crack? And it was actually this moment of like that art and other art around the Radiant Citadel where I realized how, getting back to the kind of the tavern scenario, how much fantasy artists have been trained to write and create very generic Eurocentric art. And then once you push them out of that boundary, how hard it is for them to reconceptualize, and how tricky it is for them to come up with something new, because they've been trained by years and decades that Eurocentric fantasy art is the way to go. And so once you push them outside of that boundary, it becomes a lot harder for them to like build art that kind of fits the specifications and your vision.
And I must say, every single piece of artwork in the Radiant Citadel is so evocative. And I'm a DM that uses the images. So when I was running through, I ran through the Invisible Mountain scenario at the end of your book for my players. So I was showing them all the pictures of the Tepui, all these different things. And they were like, oh my God. And I was like, look, there's loads of images. Look, I'll just share them all. So I can only imagine how hard it was in the sense of like, I've got all these images in, but it's not quite right. And then pushing those people and because you're so right. I think lots of fantasy artwork is so, well, like you said, Eurocentric. It's so white-facing as well. So to be able to have a book, like you said, not only that describes these planes in such beautiful detail, but also visually display them in such amazing colors and represent them to what the author thinks is incredible. And like you said, I don't think many books do that in general. And it's so great that it does work for this book as well.
I think, trying to share, I was trying to share art images with the artists and be like, hey, the city is cut out of it. It's rock art architecture, like Indian rock art architecture. which other cultures, of course, have done, but it's very specific to India too. And getting them to understand that a city was actually carved out of the rock, out of the fossilized remains, but it's not planted on top of like an island, right? It's not like, it's not buildings on top of an island. It's actually carved right out of it. And then, the fact that it's a solar punk and hope punk. So like some of the art was very grimdark, and I was like, no, this does not work. It has to be, there can be darkness around it because it's in the ethereal plane, but actually it's bright and it's vibrant. It's full of greenery. It's full of like life. There's a lot of plant life, and capturing all of those elements was quite difficult. But on the flip side, something that was weird and evocative that really worked, I love the art for the Drought Elder and Orchids of the Invisible Mountain. So that was so good. I saw that piece of art. I was like jumping for joy. I was like, you nailed it. Like, this is fantastic. It's so freaking weird, right? A dungeon made out of the desiccated husk of like a godlike being that may or may not know that you exist as you enter it, Yeah. It was really great.
Yeah, I ran my players through that adventure, and then I have the music on, etc. And I was like, and you look out the other end and you realize you're in one part of the body, and they were like, oh, this is awful. And I was like, yeah, but it's great though, isn't it? That was definitely one of my favorite locations to take my players to.
It is one of my favorite locations in the book. It's just really amazing.
What would your big bit of advice to any kind of DM, so obviously a beginner, a veteran, or whatever, who's taken Journey Through the Radiant Citadel and is about to run their players through it, what sort of bigger piece of advice would you give them?
I think to make it feel real and different from your standard D&D is to really center it on the people and the small moments with the NPCs and the small moments of the culture, right? In the Gazetteers, there's a whole write-up about the food and the drinks and the customs. Really lean into that. And I think in leaning into that, you will transport the player from their expected Eurocentric traditional setting to something that feels fresh, evocative of the culture that's located in. They will feel like they understand the people and their mindsets, because there's definitely in all the Gazetteers something about a little bit of their philosophy or the way they think or the way they look at life. Most of the Gazetteers have a little bit about that. Rooted in that, I think in doing so, you will really transport your players into the liminal space of the specific adventure. And obviously, if you decide to link the adventures together, you have a whole campaign that really does root itself in the Radiant Citadel, because the Radiant Citadel has all of those cultures. And so you can do these interesting callbacks where the people of Akran Sangar, which is from Shadow of the Sun, what is their culture at Akran Sangar, where they have to deal with the angels ruling them, where they're maybe also the Radiant Citadel, where they're free and don't rule under them. And there's a little bit of maybe, I didn't set up Sholay to be a rebel, but she's kind of like in opposition to Atash. And so you could have there's another way of also not stereotyping people, right? The Radiant Citadel in some ways is a great opportunity to say, and this is the problem I think sometimes with white cultures looking at non-white cultures is like, oh, everybody from India is the same. It's like, no, actually, really, we're not.
Very different.
Also, very, very different, right? And then what are the people like from Ottawa that are living in Ottawa versus the people that are from Ottawa that are living in the Radiant Citadel, or the people from Akran Sangar? That Akran Sangar is a really perfect one, because the governments are so different from the people, and so their attitudes are going to be different. And maybe even their religious beliefs are going to be different. And I think leaning on that, they're like, maybe some believe in the Sunweaver and believe in Atash, and others who are at the Radiant Citadel and kind of dealing with Sholay remember different religions or different kind of ideas of how to live. And so that's really where I would lean into as a DM, because I feel like that brings a lot more richness and thoughtfulness about the book and nuanced complexity to the book.
Yeah, I'd forgotten in that sort of thing that you do have those two leaders in opposition, and it is such a beautiful, very tense, and that's another story idea. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I will borrow that for the next game, so I will take that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting showdown between a solar and an ancient brass dragon, and they're both very powerful entities in their own right. Not enough room for like complex stat plots, but I definitely have ideas about how they're unique characters with a lot more behind them than the traditional stat blocks behind those two. and they're both ancient and they're both powerful, and they both have very strong visions for what the future are. And they are, in some ways, on a collision course, which could theoretically put the Radiant Citadel in opposition to Akaran Sangar. And what does that mean? What happens to trade? There's all these rippling implications. Suddenly, like, let's say those two cultures come into conflict, and then trade collapses between them. But then that has a ripple effect of trade collapsing to other places as well, because things are not coming through. And suddenly, some of those areas are in crisis because they're not getting food or supplies from one of the other 15. You have a whole interesting, complex storyline that isn't based around simply like a dragon attacks, or a lich comes and attacks. It's like, yes, you can do a lot more than that, right? We move past the 101 arch nemesis kind of scenario.
And even that doesn't involve the players at all, which is great. Like they just are they could be easily like this little cogs in that and just be affected by it. And then they have to deal with the fallout as well. They don't have to be the instigators per se. They might do, but again, it could just be something that you as a DM sort of put in the background for them to realize and to live through as well. It could be an interesting one.
Yeah, it's an interesting place of where they could live through this scenario, and that gives you the sense of, something grander and bigger. It could also be that like there are consequences of actions. Like maybe they were sent by Cholet to do something.
Yes.
And like they're part of the shield bearers, for instance, and then they screw up or they do something that breaks like the code of the Radiant Citadel, and that makes Atash mad at them, and then takes it out on the Radiant Citadel. But the characters are the ones who started this shit, and so they're like, oh no, now Atash and Cholet are at odds. But
have both of them, yeah.
Yeah, and so like there's this conflict because the players are like still at the center of things, creating this, but like there's a reason why these two groups are already ready and primed to have problems with each other.
Ajit, well, thank you so much for this amazing talk. I know we could talk about for hours because, your passion for the book and me reading the book, I'm going, I would love to talk to you. So I'm so glad we get to have this. My final question is, where can we find Radiant Citadel? And do you have any other upcoming projects that you can talk about RPG wise or not, or anything else you'd like to plug? And where can we find you on social media if that is something you'd like to plug?
Yeah. You can find Journeys to the Radiant Citadel pretty much anywhere, your local game store, Amazon, online. It's pretty easy. So just Google Journeys to the Radiant Citadel and it'll be easy to find there. I am most easily accessible on Twitter at Ajit George, SB. That's AJITGEORGE, SB. I post often about RPG stuff or politics, or my full-time work is Shanti Bhavan. Very easy to find me there. In terms of things that I can plug right now, I just came back from an the things I can talk about is I just came back from an incredible World of Darkness LARP. That's why it's sort of in front of mind in New Orleans, which is wonderful. And I would recommend, this is not my own stuff, but I would recommend checking out if you're a LARPer and you enjoy LARPing, check out the stuff by Reverie Studios and maybe follow what they're doing. And the thing that I'm going to be gearing up for next year that is public would be I work with people of color at a big bad con.
Yes.
If you are, it doesn't really matter whether you're a person of color or from any other community or any other group. Big Bad Con is a small con that punches way above its weight in terms of like its impact in the industry. Journeys to the Radiant Citadel wouldn't exist without it because a lot of the original writers that worked on it came from it or were recommended by people that were in attendance in 2019. And we just held 2022. There was this great event where we had a bunch of people of color flown in from all around the world and had a huge networking event for them. But I think also if you're just an emerging game designer or writer or designer and you want to find a small con where you can meet a lot of industry professionals, that's actually, you're more likely to like have a chance to talk to top level industry professionals at Big Bad Con in the 4 days or 3 days that you're there than 4 days at Gen Con because it's much more manageable and the industry professionals are a lot more accessible. So I would recommend keeping an eye out for Big Bad Con 2023. Beyond that, like my fingers are on a few things, but it's
you're spinning so many plates.
Yeah, it's busy, but fun.
But good busy. So
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy to interview you, and I can't wait to. I'm going to reread it again because I've enjoyed Journeys so much, and thank you.
Oh, it was a pleasure talking to you, Fiona. Thank you for having me on.